Well, hi everyone. My name is Graham Feyl. I am a PhD student here at UCSB in the history of art and architecture, and I'm one of the co-curators of the exhibition Please Come In. And I am so delighted to have been in the audience with you to watch this incredible movie, but I'm also just excited to be here with Lucas Hilderbrand to kind of discuss Paris is Burning, as well as his brand new book, The Bars Are Ours, Histories and Cultures of Gay Bars in America, 1960 and After. I just want to say thank you so much for being here. It's such an honor. When Sylvie and I were trying to sort of plan this exhibition and think about who we'd want to talk to, we had been watching Paris is Burning as inspiration, and we knew you'd done this book about Paris is Burning, and then you also just this week came out with The Bars Are Ours, and we felt it was very serendipitous to have this moment with you. So again, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for the invitation. So I want to thank everyone at the Carsey Wolf, as well as you and Sylvia for the invitation and for bringing me into this conversation.
Of course. So, this film and documentary is simply fantastic. And I think a way to kind of get us started that I always like to think about when we think about Paris is Burning is I like to ask, when and where were you when you first saw this film? It is such, I bet, I don't know if any of you in the audience, this is your first time seeing the film or whatnot, but I know for me it was a very pivotal moment. And so I'd love to kind of just situate where you were when you first saw this.
Yeah, so the film began screening on the festival circuit in 1990, and it was in release in 1991. And I grew up in a small town in South Dakota, which did not generally get documentaries, certainly not queer documentaries. And Sioux Falls, which was the largest town in the state, began its first ever art film series in early 1992. It was a 6-week series. There was attention in the local press. I was in high school. I was a voracious cinephile, would talk my friends into driving down to Sioux Falls to see each film. But when they announced this series, they only announced the first 5 films. And it was a mystery to me what was the 6th film. And I, to this day, don't know if it was caginess about the queer content or if they didn't have a plan. But sort of weekly we were driving down, and then finally the last week I looked in the listings in the newspaper, and it said Paris is Burning. I had read about Paris is Burning. It's one of those texts, and this is before the internet. So it was something like you might read about a film, and you're like, I hope someday I get to see that film. It's something that you didn't necessarily have immediate access to. So I knew what the film was, and I'd been wanting to see it, but imagined it might be in college or some day when I moved to a city and had access to a better video store that I would be able to see it. So anyway, it was screening in Sioux Falls. I talked some friends into driving with me to go get to the theater. They were seniors, I was a sophomore. They get in, and then they ask me for ID. So the film was released without a rating because it's a documentary. And I was 16, so they wouldn't sell me a ticket. So I bought a ticket for an R-rated movie, which they did not ask for an ID for, and then snuck into the theater, sort of very anxiously worried for the first 20 minutes that I was going to get kicked out. So it was both this it was a really transformative moment, both because it was such a revelation as a film, and really sort of opened up a world of queer possibility to me, is really what it meant to me in that moment. But also is sort of surrounded by all this context of sort of longing for a kind of access to both cinema and queer life that I didn't immediately have normally, as well as the sort of transgression or taboo surrounding that, the literalness of how I snuck into the movie theater.
Oh, that's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could kind of expand further then on this idea. This film is about, resistance and beauty and spectacle and performance. The joys of life are all in this film.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk more about this sort of queer potential you see in it, and if you can kind of expand on that a little bit more.
Well, for me, it's a film that has been very divisive, and I would never deny that. So there are people who watch the film and they find it to be very sad. They find it to be very tragic, particularly what happens with Venus. Yeah. And so one of the critiques of the film is that it doesn't sit with that mourning. It doesn't sit with that sadness, and it just moves forward too quickly. And for me, the film is not about sort of the film is very much aware, the people in the film are aware of the structures of oppression. They're aware of all of the sort of challenges of their life, economically, in terms of racism, in terms of homophobia, transphobia, what have you. And sort of, and they understand those structural oppressions that are part of their life. And for me, the film isn't about that. So it's about the ways in which the people in the film self-define and find innovative ways to live in spite of and in resistance or challenge to those structures. And the film doesn't deny those structures. The film is very explicit that racism exists, the homophobia, transphobia exists. The film knows that, and it's very explicit, and the people in the film are explicit about that. But it's about finding and making a livable life on one's own terms, and living sort of as who you are and who you're meant to be, in spite of whatever society or sort of the dominant culture thinks. And that's what the film is about to me.
Yeah. No, and thank you for that. And sort of thinking about this idea of, there's resistance, and yet there's also looking at these pockets of queer possibility. I was wondering if you can touch on and expand on then this legacy of the documentary a little bit, because I do think, it's, as it's kind of developed, from its original showing, it's moved into such a, it's, even how it's streamed, you can stream it now online. And so I think it's this sort of, it's, the access to it is so different than trying to see it in like an art circuit within, it's not rated, you don't know what it is. And so I wonder if you can talk about this sort of legacy of the film.
Yeah, so I think, so when the film came out, it was actually, it toured the festival circuit, it won a number of awards, it had a run at the Film Forum in New York, it broke all of the house records, it didn't yet have a distribution deal at that point. And effectively, no one would distribute it because Ginny had not cleared the music rights to the film. The Film Forum run, which they kept extending because it kept selling out every showing and breaking all the house records, the Film Forum run paid for the music rights. At that point, Miramax said, we'll distribute the film. They released it, it actually was one of the highest grossing documentaries and one of the highest grossing queer films of its time. And then had a vibrant home video life as well. It was also immediately taught in colleges, particularly with the emergence of queer theory. It became a companion to teach Judith Butler. So when she is theorizing gender as performative, this was the film people showed to illustrate what that meant. So it became a really significant film, and it had both a sort of a critical prominence, but it was also a popular documentary in a moment when there weren't very many popular documentaries. And so the other thing that was important in its time is that although it's one of the central films of what was called the new queer cinema of the early 1990s, it was really the only film of that wave that sort of both had a kind of crossover popularity and had sort of an extended afterlife within queer culture, and particularly gay male culture in terms of quoting the film, referencing the film. But it also was sort of the only film of that cycle that was a very strong and powerful and prominent representation, particularly of trans of color life. And it had the sort of burden of representation of being the most prominent, the most popular, sort of the go-to text, representing sort of a number of different communities. And it's really not until the last, say, 15 years that we've begun to see, I wouldn't even say an abundance of representations, but more representations, other representations, and which really wouldn't have existed or wouldn't have gotten distribution or wouldn't have gotten greenlit without Paris is Burning. So we have RuPaul's Drag Race because of Paris is Burning. And it was actually the show Bible for the producers when they started. They made everyone watch the film as sort of a way in to understand both the culture, but also a lot of the cultural references that RuPaul was interested in bringing to the show. Without Paris is Burning, we wouldn't have Pose, which was an important move towards shifting how representations get made and who is performing as trans of color talent in terms of sort of authentically casting within these roles, but also inviting the ball community in to participate and shape and sort of be part of making representations of the ball community. We wouldn't have Legendary without Paris is Burning. So I think there are ways in which particularly within the ball community, there are some critiques of Paris is Burning, or there's a certain sort of resistance that it's sort of for 30 years was the go-to reference, as though it was the only reference or the only way to understand the ball culture. And it's only in the last several years that we've begun to see other representations sort of move the culture forward, but also to understand ways to represent the community with the community's participation and sort of rethinking sort of what does it mean to represent this community.
Yeah, that's actually really wonderful, because my next question was sort of going off of this a little bit, is I was kind of interested in this like generational shifting and like engagement with Paris is Burning, because the second time I had seen the film myself was in Chicago at the Music Box Theater, and throughout the film they kind of highlight the different sort of terms like realness, mopping, which is stealing, and so they and there's a young group of like young queer kids in front of me watching it, and like when they talked about shade and reading, one of them whips around with their friends and they say, we say those words. And I remember thinking, I was like, well, it's those words, moved through the culture. Right. And so I'm just curious if you could talk more about this generational, because you're thinking about, shows like Legendary and Pose kind of are thinking about the legacy of Paris is Burning, so.
Yeah, so one of the things, and this was also true of my research for the BAR project, is that when I was in the archive, what I repeatedly found was that the things that I had experienced as a young person going out and thought were new for my generation had these histories. And there was such a sense of deja vu or repetition, or sort of we're returning to so many of the same strategies or debates or even sort of ways of partying that sort of I didn't know had these longer histories. And I think that's what we're seeing with the next generation, where they've grown up with this language, which maybe they know it from Drag Race, maybe they know it from somewhere else, but they don't have sort of the queer cultural history to know sort of the genealogy of where that term comes from and how it actually entered the culture. So that, so like straight coworkers know what shade is now, which I don't think would be the case without this film sort of opening it up. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about the film, so when I was writing on the film, it was really important to me to also be very clear, I'm writing about this film as a film. I'm a film scholar, and so a lot of the writing about the film had come from other disciplines and other fields, and they sort of treated it as this representation that was somehow unmediated, as though sort of this was they could just sort of critique the ideologies of the people within the film, or they could sort of just talk about this film without understanding it as having been constructed. It's a highly, highly edited film. It's a sort of engineered in a way that gives it a structure that actually isn't organic. So if you think about the film, there's not a narrative. It's not structured around any particular event. There's not scenes of like following people around and sort of things happening organically that gives it an inherent structure. What it is it's a lot of ball footage and it's some interviews that somehow get stitched together in this way that is, at least for me, so dynamic, so engrossing, but also sort of forces so many juxtapositions that come to feel seamless. But if you step back and think about it, the structure is actually really complicated and hard to understand. And there's all these ways in which we have disparate footage edited together with audio interviews or voiceover that we don't know who's speaking, and it doesn't match who's on screen necessarily. We're cutting together different moments. We have layers of music. So it's a marvel of editing as a film. But what was interesting when I was working on the book is talking to the director and the editor, and they actually came to the project with different agendas and different goals. So the director, Ginny Livingston, would always say, I want this to have a political edge. She had been an activist. She had sort of been trained in sort of, collegiate leftist politics, and sort of had that sort of framework and that kind of goal in mind for what the film would do. The editor was coming at it from more of a storytelling point of view. And he felt like we want people to like the people, to understand the people, and that he wanted the people to have an emotional experience. And so they really sort of together sort of had this it's really sort of a product of their two sort of worldviews coming together. And effectively, she sort of approached the film after having spent years with the people she filmed and interviewed, feeling like an insider and sort of having a kind of intimacy with the people in the film, whereas the editor sort of really wanted to bring the audience in and open this world out to the audience. So one of the things that we see is that the structure of introducing language and terms and identifying people really comes from the editor wanting to open this world up to an audience who isn't part of that world. Whereas I think moments of intimacy, moments of feeling like we are part of this culture already by being in the audience, come from the director.
So thinking through this idea a little bit of this sort of, it's, not a fragmented thing, but as you talk about, the storyline's not necessarily linear, or we don't know who's talking and what, something that I think has been important for Sylvia and I's curatorial approach has been thinking through kind of queer time and place, queer ephemerality. And I was wondering if you sort of talk about what does it mean to work on something like Paris is Burning, where it's not necessarily a linear narrative. There is a historical kind of, they go through, 87 to 88, or, and it's, so there is a linearity happening. And then I have a second part of this question, so I'll just kind of wait for.
Okay. Yeah. When I talk about there's not a narrative, so there's not a film where it's about we're going to prepare for a ball and then it's leading up to this moment and then there's this climactic ball sequence. It's not how it's structured. So we have footage from 1987 and we have footage from 1989. And there's a little fudging because there's some material from before 87, there's some audio recordings from before, what have you. But even within the 87 sequence, we see footage that isn't in chronological order, but it is about creating a feeling. So I think this is a film that really models that sort of a queer documentary in many ways is about imagining sort of fabulation, but it's also about affect. It's about creating this sort of sense of possibility and abundance and ingenuity in ways that isn't about sort of giving us a linear story, but it's about sort of understanding the world and remaking it on one's own terms. Even the fact that the doors open at 5 a.m., they start at 7 a.m., but famously never actually start on time. And so I just imagine everyone is sort of delirious by the time it starts because they're so sort of sleep deprived, or they've been up all night preparing for the ball, and then it takes hours and hours and hours. So it's almost like this inversion of normative time.
So with thinking about this sort of, I love this idea of inversion of normative time, and it's just, when we're thinking about the sort of queer spaces and material cultures that we were looking at for Please Come In, it was kind of working through these ideas of materials and spaces that are fleeting, because here they were doing it at the Imperial Elks Lodge, which like itself had other functions, at other times. And so part of this brings me to this idea of like working with a queer archive and a queer history. And this is very much what your new book is thinking about, right? The Bars Are Ours, thinking about gay bar culture. And I was wondering if you could sort of talk more of what it means to work with queer history and the queer archive.
So one of the things that was really important to me is to make sure that the new project, the bar project, is really archivally grounded in a way. So effectively I went to every community archive or every special collection I could find in the country that might have material related to this history. And in the early periods of doing the research, most of what I found were these fascinating objects. So they might be matchbooks, party flyers, what have you, that had these sort of that sort of complicate this idea of ephemera, and we talked about this earlier. So like these are things that are like they're tangible. They're real things that have endured through time. They still exist. The matchbooks, are physical objects that still exist in an archive. But what they don't have is context, oftentimes. So they're traces in a way, or they're remains in a certain way. More than I would call them ephemera, even though sort of these collections are usually called ephemera.
Yeah.
But they're kind of the details of a queer past that you can touch, and you can and through that tangibility, you can almost have a sense of this connection to the past. It's like you're touching the past, but on some level, you're going to be projecting onto this past, or you're bringing your own experience of going out and what happens at bars, or what your own experiences are, in order to imagine and embellish these physical traces and what they help us to understand about the sense of contact with the past. But in terms of like fleshing out or writing an actual history or learning what actually happened or how was it reported, I really relied upon the gay press to give me a sense of actually telling me the information, telling the story, documenting the debates around a particular thing and what the discourses were within the community at any particular time. So although a matchbook might be a fascinating trace of a bar, it doesn't tell you very much about the bar. Yeah.
So thinking about this new project you have with bars, I was wondering if you could talk about, do you see this as a bridge with this thinking about Paris is Burning, as a film itself, and not so, because you situate yourself not as participating in ballrooms, but you're just looking at the film itself with your new book. And if you could talk about The Bars Are Ours a little bit.
So each project I've written is a bit of a pivot to and there's a kind of an intuitive sense to me that I just follow whatever I'm interested in. But I mean, certainly you could say there's continuities, because in both projects they're about thinking about queer nightlife and thinking about how it gets mediated, and how do we understand the queer past through those mediations or through this framework of nightlife. But after working on the Paris book, I think, and we talked about this in a previous conversation, I mean, I think the emergence of the ball community and of these events in many ways was a formation that developed because gay bars had failed communities of color and trans communities of color, because they weren't always welcoming spaces, or the ball community didn't necessarily have the resources to sustain and support a bar that catered specifically to them, when there were other demographics that had more affluence to sustain a bar. So I think in many ways the invention of the houses, the invention of the ball scene and the ball culture was a distinct formation separate from, or possibly in rejection to or in tension with, gay bars more generally, which had historically been very white, very cis, very male. So the new book actually doesn't talk about the ballroom scene at all, but I think working on the Paris project helped me in many ways begin thinking about what are the possibilities of bars and what do bars make possible. So I talk about the bars as a medium in the new book because I'm a media scholar, but I don't actually think of them as a medium like film or television. I just think of them as a structure that allows for certain kinds of expression, certain kinds of cultures to form, and it gives it a shape in a certain way. And it has affordances and limitations and specificities and things that we might say about any other visual medium. But it also is a structure that allows for the invention of new kinds of cultures, new kinds of parties, but it also becomes the way in which debates within the community were mediated. So the bar functions as the site to address racism in the gay community, or gentrification and class differences within the community, or generational divides between baby boomers and Gen Xers, that kind of thing.
So something you're sort of getting at that I think was really important for our exhibition was thinking through this like fluidity of spaces a little bit. You're talking about it is people move like through like physical structures of bars, or we can even say the ballrooms, but then they're also moving through like ideologies, generational ideas, they're kind of separating themselves, via gender or race or the bars as a spatial thing. And so when we were conceiving of Please Come In, we were thinking about how spaces like the living room, the discotheque, the bathroom, and the dive bar are all fluidly interconnected. Like people move between, you can move between them in a very kind of form of queer placemaking. And so I was wondering if you could talk about kind of the fluidity that you see within bars as structures, as well as even reflecting back to the ballrooms.
Yeah. So when I was working on the project, people would often ask things like, "Oh, are you going to talk about discos? Are you going to talk about this?" And it's like, yes, of course. Like, why would I sort of compartmentalize?
Yeah.
And so one of the things I say in the introduction is that sort of I'm not interested in narrowing the scope of what is a gay bar. I'm not interested in sort of what the specific zoning definition of a pub versus a tavern versus an after-hours venue might be, and all those things matter in terms of liquor licenses or sort of the ways in which those spaces are regulated or what hours they can operate. But in lived experience, people move between these venues and in lived experience, the difference between a pub, a tavern, a disco, and an after-hours venue probably doesn't really matter. But also, these are symbiotic spaces as well. So I talk about bathhouses because sort of they exist both within the same culture, but also people would go to the bathhouse after the bar if they didn't get lucky at the bar. Or they might have a siesta and then go back to continue dancing at the disco or what have you. So these spaces sort of really bleed into each other in terms of who is using them and how people use them. What I also talk about is that even the street outside the bars, the bodega, the greasy spoon, the all-night diner, these spaces are all part of nightlife, and they all sort of are part of that experience. The experience of getting dressed at home in your bedroom before you go out is part of the experience of going out, and there's calculations about what you want to wear and how you're dressing and why. So are you dressing because you want to be pretty, you want to impress? Are you dressing because you're going to get sweaty, because you're going to a dance club? Are you dressing to be warm because it's going to be cold out? Are you dressing with a coat that has a kind of armor so that you're not harassed or you're not clockable on the street? All these things are calculations that matter in terms of how you comport yourself and how you sort of navigate space on the way to the bar, but also even within the bar.
So I think something you're actually picking up on that we find, I think I speak in the we, because part of our process was very much working collaboratively in a very queer curatorial way. So when I say we, I evoke Sylvia and I in this, but when you talk about, this spillage, that's such an important concept for us. Thinking about, when the night's over, they're playing Donna Summer's Last Dance or whatnot, calling it quits. People run out into the street, they're waiting for their taxis or Ubers, maybe smoking their last few cigarettes, and there's like the remnants, and you can still kind of hear and feel that pulsating. I was wondering if
it's called the sidewalk sale because it's the last call and you're on the sidewalk looking for someone to take
okay.
home. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you, because we even saw this in the film, such as like when, Pepe Le Pew is like in her costume, like walking like from outside inside, like crossing that threshold is so beautiful. And it's, again, going from the outside world inward into the ballrooms. And I was wondering if you could sort of talk about that sort of remnants of queer material culture a little bit and thinking about that, I know we talked a little about like, what does it mean to think about ephemerality or that spillage, but how does it also in turn reflect, let's say, a queer material culture?
Well, I mean, one thing that I think is interesting is, I would say one of the things that most interested me when I first started the project, and a lot of what exists to this day as ephemera are the advertisements from gay bars. And in many cases, more people would have seen the ads than ever crossed the threshold to those bars. But also, advertisements very rarely represented or documented what the bar actually looked like inside or any of the people who went there. Advertisements primarily construct a fantasy image for the bar. They're literally constructing an image. And that was really interesting to me because it was a different form of knowledge, and it sort of is creating a fantasy of what nightlife could be, or it's training people who go to the bar in terms of what to wear, sort of how to self-present. It's teaching you the codes. It's teaching you the reference for that particular bar. But also, I think for many people, particularly the first time or the first few times they go to a gay bar, there's this anxiety about the threshold, and there's this anxiety about being seen on the street in front of the bar, and sort of the public visibility of that, and the ways in which that makes you vulnerable, but it also outs you in a certain way, or people make assumptions that if you're in that space that you're a gay person. So there's a way in which the lived experience of going to these bars is often bound up in sort of submitting to or accepting one's visibility, and accepting that you're going to be interpolated a particular way if you're seen sort of in front of or on the threshold of or inside of one of these venues.
And also, I mean, this idea of being seen reminds me of the scene in Paris when, I believe it was Pepper LaBeija was saying, you know, my father saw me.
Yeah.
And then told my mother. And visibility is both, you know, we discussed a little bit earlier, you know, visibility is both important, yet it can be tricky. It's a very difficult thing to think about, but I think something that your new book is thinking about, as well as we saw in the documentary, is that I think one of the beauties of this is this sort of relationality and community that comes forward. This kind of visibility is a collectivity at the same time. So I was wondering if you could sort of discuss, you know, what relationality looks like for you in your text, and how that's really important to thinking through community, because this was one of the ways that we have formulated the exhibition, was thinking that these you know, to try to capture, I think, the beauty of queer spaces, you know, we didn't want to limit, but we had to have some structure, something to hold on to. And it was ephemerality, relationality, and performativity. And so I was thinking if you could kind of discuss more about relationality.
Well, just sort of starting with visibility. So I mean, yeah. So what we see in the film and in people's lives is sort of visibility. On the one hand, is often understood as a precondition to political intelligibility and sort of enfranchisement in a particular way. If you're rendered invisible, you're not counted. You don't have power. Those kinds of things. But at the same time, visibility makes you vulnerable. It makes you a target. It's that sort of trap of visibility. And we see this politically sort of at moments of increased visibility. More recently for trans life and trans rights, we see a backlash. We see a spike in anti-trans violence. We see anti-trans bills. We see anti-drag bills. And so these things exist in tension. That sort of visibility is important to enfranchisement, but it also makes you vulnerable to new kinds of violence because you're newly legible in a certain way. And I think part of what is really important about this film, but also tragic about the film, is that the film has made the ball world sort of more visible for people who weren't subjects of the film. But for a lot of people, particularly in the first several years after the film came out, it was their introduction to the ball world, and so people would move to New York, or they would sort of find their way to this community. But the people who were actually in the film itself often felt like they didn't necessarily benefit from being in the film. So whether it's the fact that they didn't really make any money off of being in it, or they felt exploited in a particular way. So their visibility made them vulnerable. It may not have rewarded them or made their lives better, but it opened the possibility for future generations, for viewers, to imagine or to find the communities that the film made possible. And I think that's also one of the interesting tensions with Paris is Burning in particular, is that it's a complicated film because it sort of didn't necessarily improve the lives of the people in the film, but it actually made the world a better place through its existence.
That's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
I do think, you know, I think we can keep going for hours with this conversation, but I would love to open this up to the audience now if you have any questions.
Hi, Thank you so much for joining us, and this is wonderful to hear. I have a question about the advertisements actually for the bars. I'm curious about where they were circulated and who saw them. You know, was it a specific venue, et cetera? And then I have a second question, but I'd like to hear that one first.
Yeah, so we see bar ads circulate in a couple of different ways. So the place that I've seen the most of them that they're most preserved was that they were advertisements in the gay press. So for the most part, the local gay press, as it emerged in the 1960s and it grew and expanded in the later 20th century, bar ads were basically what sustained and supported the gay press, particularly in the early decades. It was through bar advertisements that there could even be a gay press. And particularly in the 60s and 70s, in the early days of different local publications, a lot of the content were these sort of society page retellings of what was happening at the gay bars. So there was a real symbiotic relationship between the bars and the press, because advertising from bars is what sustained the press, but then you could also access the newspapers or magazines through the bars as well. So without the bars, there may not have been a gay press, or it would have looked like a different thing early on, but that was really my primary source for finding different bar ads. You also sometimes find little handbills or flyers or usually little cards like this, or maybe 8.5 by 11 Xerox flyers for different kinds of parties and things. Those tended to be for special events or for one-off parties rather than for bars themselves. And then a number of bars also would have custom designed matchbooks because people used to actually smoke in bars, and people were heavy smokers back then. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just bouncing off of this idea about the spaces where the bars are located, and I'm thinking about Paris is Burning and New York City in the late 80s. And so one of the things that I feel when I'm watching this film is a little bit of a counter-historical trend in like who the population of gay culture in this prehistory is, and so when you're looking at the characters in the film, for lack of a better word, you know, the music that characterizes them, you see the scene of them in the piers with this big boom box, and it's the street culture of New York City in the late 80s. And so part of what I was thinking about was, can we talk about the kinds of music that are in this film, the kinds of New York City culture in the late 80s that maybe isn't typically thought of as being part of queer history, when we have such a strong emphasis on disco, but there's a kind of particular manifestation in New York. And I'm thinking about hip hop and how much of a part of people's lives it was at this time. That's an open question.
Yeah, yes, I agree. So I mean, one of the things that I think makes this film feel so vibrant, but also sort of, in many ways, of a very particular time, is that, I mean, what we're seeing on screen in terms of street life is exactly what Giuliani tried to eradicate in his quality of life campaigns. And so it's a New York that doesn't exist anymore. It certainly doesn't exist in this way anymore. And I think that there is, in some ways, a sense of loss, not only for the people, but also the kinds of public spaces that continue to exist in this film. And when I went back to revisit the film and rewatch it really closely when I was working on the book, one of the things that really struck me that I hadn't noticed the dozens of times I'd watched it for pleasure before then was that there are so many cutaways or scenes that are framed with people in the background of same-sex intimacy and affection between men of color and queer people. And it's a film that it never comments on this. It never sort of makes it an overt statement. But there are so many images of public intimacy, public affection, and claiming space and right to sort of express one's not only sexuality, not only one's gender, but also one's affectional preferences, and claim space and the right to have PDAs. And throughout the film, we see these moments that are actually incredibly sweet, incredibly intimate, incredibly affectionate. And I realized not only had I not sort of been conscious of that, although certainly it would have affected how I understood the film, but nothing I'd ever read about the film had ever acknowledged that either. But I think sort of part of what was lost is not just the architecture or the garbage on the street, but sort of this sort of sense of what George Chauncey said, privacy could only be had in public. So people may not have had spaces at home to hang out with their boyfriend or the lovers or whatever, but sort of claiming space and sort of having that kind of affection in those spaces and claiming spaces for those purposes is really part of the texture of the city and is part of the texture of the film and is part of creating and making queer worlds and claiming the right to be in those spaces and the right to live and have lives that are fulfilling and rewarding and self-determined in those spaces.
Well, okay, wonderful. Well, Lucas, thank you so much for such a great conversation
thank you for
around
having me.
this incredible documentary.
Yeah.
I want to thank the Carsey Wolf Center for showing Paris is Burning and this beautiful sister program to please come in. We do invite you to go see Please Come In before it does close December 17th. And thank you all for being here tonight. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.